Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Auslin, and I'm the Payson J. Treat Distinguished Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution. I'd like to welcome you to the Hoover Capital Conversations series. The Hoover Institution is a preeminent research center whose mission is dedicated to the principles of individual, economic, and political freedom, private enterprise, and limited representative government. In this series, we'll be discussing policy with policymakers. Capital Conversations bring Hoover Fellows together with policymakers for informed, in-depth discussions examining some of our nation's most vexing policy issues. By bringing together the key players in policy development and policy execution, we hope to enrich the landscape of ideas, ask bold questions, and seek powerful solutions to improve people's lives. Today, we'll be talking to Senator Marsha Blackburn. The title of our discussion is From Huawei to Hong Kong, how the US and China are clashing around the world. As part of this discussion, we will be taking audience questions and encourage you to submit yours at the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. Let's get started. Senator Blackburn is a United States Senator from Tennessee. She is currently serving on the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, the Judiciary Committee, the Veterans Affairs Committee, and the Armed Services Committee. She has dedicated her service to promoting opportunities for women and making America a more prosperous place to live. Senator, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm delighted to join you and so pleased to see groups and organizations paying attention to the issues that we have with China and how important they are to our nation's economic health, our health and well-being, great power competition, and a host of other issues that Americans now realize affect them every single day.
Well, Senator, you've been a leader on these issues in the Senate. You recently released an extremely detailed and informative white paper that I encourage everyone to read, which looks at US-China relations in a post-COVID world. And I think we've got the most important topic in foreign policy today. One of the key things that we hear regularly is that the US and China, so Washington and Beijing, are not only in a competition for influence and power around the world, but are in a competition to shape the rules of global governance. How do we ensure that the US, not China, is driving global governance?
Yes, and Michael, I appreciate that because we hear this so many times, and especially when you look at Southeast Asia and ASEAN as a region, then it comes into play. How do we build allies in this region of the world? And how do we rely on those allies to help us as we fight back or push back against China and their goal for global dominance? And I think in setting the landscape for that, we have to realize that China has looked at all that they are doing as part of a 100-year marathon that will lead them to the China century being the 21st century, when they become the center of economic and military power, and they exert their influence around the globe. Now, when we say, how do we, as the United States of America, who have our focus on freedom, free people, free markets, fight back against a country that is communist in control, that is Marxist in their theory? One of the best things that we can do is to have strong allies. And in working with these allies, one of the best things that we can do is to role model how you deal with and work with adversaries, how you hold them to account. And really, it is important for us to lead by example. And I will say, I think Secretary Pompeo has done an excellent job in laying forth the issues around China and how we have dealt with them in the past, and how we should move to a posture of dealing with them in the future. I really appreciated his comments, his remarks that he made at the Nixon Library in addressing this. Also, as we talk about this, I think you have to look at Japan as a strategic ally and the actions that they took post-COVID and how they dealt with China and how they incentivized businesses, Japanese businesses that were manufacturing in China to return to Japan. I think also looking at Australia, another strategic ally of ours, how they have pushed forward with holding China to account, breaking some relationships, repositioning some of their global relationships. So the stronger we are and the more closely connected we are with our allies, I think that it helps us.
One of the ways that we work with allies most closely, as you point out, is not just on a bilateral basis, but in international bodies. And of course, the hallmark of the post-World War II world that we built was a web of international bodies covering everything from health to finance to even security. But over the past decade, China has assiduously worked to control a number of these bodies, many of them, in fact, up to about 24. Where do we need to claw back in international bodies? What are the important ones? How do we do it? And how do we work with our allies on that?
Yeah, and I had in the white paper, and you mentioned the white paper, and that's available on our blackburn.senate.gov website. We have looked at this because this is where you have those interactions and relationships. China is a member state of 50 intergovernmental organizations, and then there are 1,275 international non-governmental organizations where they have a participation. And what we have seen happen, people allowed China into these organizations thinking we can help them as they try to become a member of the global community. But what has happened has been that China has used their Marxist theories to try to force change into these organizations. So it has kind of worked as at cross purposes, if you will. And what many of these organizations are realizing is that China would like to see a great modern socialist century, which is not where a lot of these organizations are. Here are a couple of organizations and things where we need to be mindful. International Telecom Union, the ITU, and people that are involved in technology policy are quite familiar with this organization. And they should really consider the degree to which its Director General, which is a Chinese telecommunications engineer, Mr. Zhao, is exerting his influence to promote the Belt and Road infrastructure projects, especially those that disproportionately benefit Huawei. And this is an awareness we have, our allies have it. Of course, you've had Japan push away Huawei, you have had Great Britain recently push away Huawei. And so this is an area where we can raise this awareness and say what is happening here is incorrect. The International Civil Aviation Organization, their Twitter account blocked all accounts that criticized its rejection of Taiwan's bids to join the organization in January of this year. And the ICAO should review the anti-Taiwan bias of its two-term Director General Liu. That's another area where we need to stand up, should be standing up and saying what you did there is not right, to push against another member. The FAO should investigate claims that the PRC forgave tens of millions of dollars of debt to an African state in exchange for withdrawing its candidate from the race, and threatened economic retaliation against smaller and more developing countries if they oppose China's plan in this organization. Again, China going in heavy-handed, not as someone who is a member of the community of nations, but someone who is there to push their specific agenda. And then when you look at the UN, they should investigate reports that the Chinese head of the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs abused his role to discriminate against individuals and organizations criticizing Chinese oppression of the Uyghurs. And, you know, this is an area where we all say, my goodness, we have to stand against these human rights abuses. We also should stand against China having a seat on the UN's Human Rights Council. And then we've got a list of other things, including Senate legislation that S2528 that would require the Director of National Intelligence to submit to Congress a report on the purpose, scope, and means of expanded Chinese influence in international organizations. And Michael, I think if we had this every year, where we could assess the direction that these organizations are moving and pinpoint problems so that addressing them with our allies and within these organizations would be done in an expeditious manner, that would certainly be something that would be helpful. And another thing that I think as we look at COVID, we all remember how President George W. Bush had the International Partnership on Avian and Pandemic Influenza. The U.S. should lead this effort, and we should find out exactly how this virus came to be, what happened in Wuhan, some of the decisions that the Chinese Communist Party made early on in this, and there should be a desire from the community of nations to figure out exactly what happened.
I'd like to pivot, if I can, to the issue of technology. And you've been as well, both in the white paper you covered extensively, but in Congress, you were the lead sponsor of the Open Tech Bill. The argument, of course, is that who controls technology, the next wave of technology, will control the world. Where do we hold the line on technology? What do we need to do? In fact, we have a question from Paul on that, which is, has the U.S. invested enough over the last 40 years in university R&D funding to compete with China? If not, is Congress working on a long-term plan to reinvest in our colleges and universities, including the University of Tennessee system? So could you talk a little bit about the tech angle? Where are we at risk? Where do we hold the line? And where do we build?
Yes, absolutely. Let me take this, and to Paul, I will say I appreciate your question. Let me break it apart, if I can, just a little bit. One of the things, and we've already mentioned Huawei, and I appreciate, Michael, that you mentioned that in your opening. Huawei's desire to embed their transmission equipment, not only in the United States, but in different areas of the world, and use this as part of their digital Silk Road to embolden their Belt and Road initiative. And that leads you to their debt diplomacy. So it all kind of gets tied in together. Have we invested enough in R&D? No. I do not think that we have. Would I like to see more invested in R&D? Yes. Would I like to see more partnerships between universities and corporations that are looking not only at 5G and 5G utilizations and spectrum utilization using that mid-band spectrum, which gets into a whole nother part of policy. But I would like to see these partnerships look at how we use this for beyond 5G and working with bright minds to say, this is something we think might be possible. And I do agree that technology is going to be the nexus for so many areas of growth. Now, in addition to that, when we talk about the military, we have to talk about cyber, and we have to talk about supercomputing, and we have to talk about artificial intelligence, and we have to talk about autonomous vehicles. And we have to acknowledge that our commercial sectors and our military sectors need to be innovating, and our military complex needs to be utilizing the new concepts that are being pushed forward in the commercial area, so that we do not lose this race as to how you use autonomous vehicles for ISR applications within the military, so that we don't lose the ability for interoperability within different forms of communication. And we have to realize also that our national labs should be a part of this. As we talk about supercomputing and spectrum development and hypersonics, and how we are going to use technology and those resources that enable this development. So he mentioned University of Tennessee. Let me just say this: there is now a partnership that Randy Boyd, who is currently the president of the University of Tennessee, has, and Chancellor Plowman, who is there, they have put a lot of energy into developing a University of Tennessee Oak Ridge Institute. And it is to bring together bright minds in a R&D type experience for how you can utilize some of this treasure from our national labs and bring it into innovation. How do we use spectrum? How do we use supercomputing? And a plug for them, Oak Ridge has the world's fastest supercomputer, the Summit, which is there at Oak Ridge. That's an area where we best the Chinese. And look at bringing together more of these partnerships so that we can say, we are doing this so that we remain dominant, not only in the development of new technologies, but in the innovation and the deployment and the commercialization of these technologies.
Thank you. There's so much more to talk about this, but I would like to shift if we can. We're going to get into audience questions, and we'll probably return to a number of these. But I would like to ask you one other question. You just mentioned the word dominance. And since World War II, the United States has been dominant in the Indo-Pacific region as a military power, both through our alliance system and our provision of public goods, such as ensuring and upholding freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation, overflight, and the like. All of that, of course, is being challenged by Beijing today and the rapid development of capabilities on the part of the Chinese military. You've been involved with and central to the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, working with Indo-PACOM and trying to position us to maintain dominance. What do we need to do in terms of the security dimension of our role in the Indo-Pacific? Where do we build? What can we do? And after that, we're going to turn to audience questions.
Yeah, and you know, aligning this using that after Russia went into Crimea and we established the EDI, the European Deterrence Initiative, that is what we have looked at for the Indo-PACOM initiative to build it up so that we are pushing back against them as they seek. And we have to bear in mind, Michael, that China will continue to push outward until we push back on them. So we have to start from that as a premise. You can look at what they've done to the Hong Kong freedom fighters. You can look at what has happened around the South China Sea, the islands. You can look at what they're doing with Taiwan and realize that. Now, what we did in the NDAA, which we have just recently passed, our chairman's mark authorizes for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, aligning the programs, the weapons, and the technologies. And we put more money, another $188.5 million above the president's request into this, because I totally agree with you. This is something that we've got to pay close attention to. Now, in this and with these funds, we are looking at the Homeland Defense System, the missile defense that would be housed there in Guam, beefing that up. We have the Maritime Security Initiative, putting more attention into that. Our mission partner environment, so that we are competing across all domains, beefing that up. Information operations, and making certain that when we look at how we gather information, that we are aligned so that we are countering propaganda and that we are countering China's malign influence. So those are all components that you're going to see housed within this, and your audience can find the NDAA document at the Senate Armed Services Committee if they want to dig a little deeper on that one.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned in particular the influence operations. It's something we've done a lot of work on at Hoover, led by our senior fellow Larry Diamond, also with H.R. McMaster and others. We have reports on Chinese influence in American interests, China's Sharp Power Project. This is something I think where we've all woken up to it, and Hoover is certainly playing a leading role. If you're just joining us, I'm Michael Auslin, Hoover Institution Fellow, and this is Hoover's Capital Conversations with Senator Marsha Blackburn. I'd like to turn, we have a lot of questions. I'd like to turn to some of the questions, go back to some of the issues that we covered, but also open up new ones. Jonathan asks that a little while ago you mentioned working with ASEAN allies. Is a re-engineered Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, one way of building our ties with that important region? Where do you stand on the issue of a free trade agreement that we're part of in the Pacific?
And one of the things that we know is that we have successfully negotiated an agreement with Japan. Ambassador Haggerty was successful in doing that before he left his service in Japan. And I think what you're going to see is more bilateral agreements. What we do know from so many of our allies in the region is that they want to have access to U.S. markets. They want to have access to U.S. products. So that import-export, it is wonderful opportunities for us. And, you know, the TPP is something that ended up with, and I will say this, Jonathan, sometimes it seems that when legislation becomes too large in DC and more things start trying to get put onto it to satisfy different requirements, that it becomes very slow to move. and then at times falls apart. So I think it is a good thing for us to begin to say, okay, if the more expedient route to dealing with trade with the country is to do these, negotiate these simultaneously but separately, then that is something that we ought to do, because what you want to do is get to a good outcome for our ally and for us, for U.S. citizens. So it is a little bit different way, but let's get to an outcome of working with our partners.
We have a question from Tal on human rights. Secretary Pompeo, of course, has the Commission on Inalienable Rights, which is really largely, although not exclusively, about religious freedom. It's something that we haven't talked about quite as much. And Tal asks, how can we encourage better human rights and more freedom in China? What type of change can be made, how, and how soon?
And I really appreciate that. And Tal, thank you for that question. To me, it is heartbreaking to hear what is being done to the Uyghurs and to see the way China has worked in Xinjiang, I think it is, and the way they have treated the Uyghurs, and the footage from the BBC marching them off to these trains it makes you gasp when you see this. And pushing back on China is important to do, letting them know we realize these human rights violations are there. As I mentioned earlier, standing against their having a seat on the Human Rights Council at the UN. And then another thing that I have worked on, and Senator Rubio and I are in process of sending another letter to the NBA. And I thank him for having joined me on this letter. I had written to Adam Silver in the NBA about their relationship with China and their training academy there in Xinjiang. And what we were hearing, ESPN said were abuses that were taking place there, and we're seeking clarification on that. But I think it's important for the corporate community, when they find out that there are these human rights abuses, that they stand up against this, and that they tell China, we're not going to buy products that are made with slave labor, that they eliminate training academies when they find out about abuses, that they hold China to account for what they are doing to the Uyghurs and how they are persecuting a religious minority. And we, as a nation who believes in equal justice under the law, equal treatment for everyone, and equality and religious freedom and free speech, these are things that we should step forward and we should say to the Chinese Communist Party, we are not going to stand for this. And we should point it out, and our allies, the more we point it out, I think the more courage our allies have in standing up against it.
Thank you. We have a question from Marvin about supply chains. Obviously, one of the great lessons we learned with the coronavirus pandemic that began in Wuhan, China, was our dangerous dependency on Chinese supply chains. So Marvin asks, would you be able to share some of the legislation Congress is drafting to wean us off of China's monopolistic supply chain stranglehold in key areas such as pharmaceuticals?
Listen, I'll be happy to talk about that one. Senator Menendez and I had filed a bill called the SAMC Act, Securing America's Medicine Cabinet. And actually, we had filed this legislation before COVID became such an issue. And the reason we did it is this. We have all heard in the last few years about contaminated pharmaceuticals that were coming out of China. People like me who have grandchildren heard about the shortage of antibiotics a couple of years ago, and it was because they were single source in China. There was one plant in China that they were making the antibiotics. The plant blows up, so globally you have a shortage. So this is why we have to bring these back. SAMC would incentivize bringing back production of our active pharmaceutical ingredients, and it would allow, we had someone ask about partnering with universities. This would look at advanced manufacturing and would partner up our pharmaceutical companies and our universities on advanced manufacturing concepts for pharmaceuticals. So yes, it is imperative that we bring these back. I have been very pleased that Peter Navarro has talked about the necessity of doing this. Larry Kudlow has mentioned it. The White House is looking at how we actually begin to bring this back. And let me say this, and to Marvin's question specifically, we have to realize that you can't just decouple from China and say, all right, we're severing. It is more like an unraveling. And whether it is critical supply chains for semiconductor chips or telecommunications equipment, or something that is used, some of our rare earth minerals or ores, or different things that need to come back stateside. What we need to realize is that one of the lessons that we have learned from COVID is we have become too dependent on China for manufacturing, and we need to return that capability and capacity, each of those, to the United States, so we do not find ourselves hamstrung. You know, back around the 1st of March, one of our pharmaceutical companies needed an active pharmaceutical ingredient. They were looking at something for a vaccine for COVID, and China was the sole source of that item. And what did China say? Oh, we may not let you have that. And we don't want to be in this position.
Thank you. We have lots of questions on tons of different topics, so we're a little bit like a billiard ball bouncing around here, but I'd like to bring you back to foreign policy. We've had a couple of questions on Taiwan. Steve asks, is there a general trend in the Senate towards supporting closer relations with Taiwan? Is there also a fear that closer relations with Taiwan could risk confrontation with Beijing? And there was another question about an Asian NATO. Do we need one to protect Taiwan? This administration has gone much farther than others in deepening relations and making closer relations with Taiwan. What is your sense of that? What should we do, and how is the Senate thinking about it?
Well, I think one of the things that you are seeing us do is recognize Taiwan's participation. I stood up for Taiwan, as did the Secretary of State, when it came to the World Health Organization. If you want to look at people that were successful in dealing with COVID, of course, Taiwan was. We have the Taiwan SOS Act, which directs the Department of State and the Department of Defense to authorize diplomats and military members from Taiwan to display their national flag on U.S. government property. And of course, this would change the directive that was there in 2015, the 2015 guidelines. I think that people will many times say, you know, let's not challenge, let's not rock the boat. I think, though, that when it comes to dealing with China and looking at how China is pushing for global dominance, that what we have to do is say, no, we're going to do what is right. And standing for Taiwan is something that is the right thing to do. Standing with the Hong Kong freedom fighters, that's the right thing to do. China had made an agreement, then they decided that they were ready to move away from that agreement. Great Britain and Boris Johnson have been very kind to support the Hong Kong freedom fighters and say, if they throw you out, come here. We will take you in. So and on an Asian NATO, that is something that is worthy of discussion. You look at our allies in the region and you have to say, is that something that is going to give you an opportunity to stand against China? Do you think that that is going to help you move faster to dealing with them, reconciling issues such as moving into the South China Sea? I honestly do not know the answer to that. I will say that it is a point that is worthy of discussion in the absence. I think it is important for the U.S. to continue to take that leadership role, working with the ASEAN nations and pushing back on China as China tries to encroach into their areas, tries to exercise a debt diplomacy and be able to encroach on different countries. So, but thank you for bringing the thought forward.
You mentioned Hong Kong, and we've watched over the past few weeks the stunning swiftness with which Beijing, through its minions in the Hong Kong Legislative Council and the executive, have essentially ended Hong Kong's freedoms as we've known it for a generation. What more can we do about Hong Kong? What are you pushing in the Senate? What are the plans, and how will we work with allies like the UK to do everything we can to protect Hong Kong's freedoms?
Well, and of course, the U.S. moved forward with the saying we were changing how we recognize their statuses. They were no longer free and independent from China. And that sent the message, I think the appropriate message, to our allies in the rest of the world that we were not going to allow China to move forward and say it is business as usual. I understand that there are many companies that have been headquartered in Hong Kong and have enjoyed having a successful business relationship there. China has enjoyed using Hong Kong basically as their banking center. But I do know that some of these businesses are looking in the region, Singapore, Seoul, different areas, and saying, where should we relocate? If this is going to be a city, an area that is again overtaken by the Chinese Communist Party, how do we extricate our operations from this area and then headquarter ourselves elsewhere? That probably is going to be a good message to the Chinese Communist Party, that people do not believe that they are going to hold with their agreement that Hong Kong can remain a financial center and that businesses can remain independent there. And we all know if you do business with China, in China, then most of those companies are partially state-owned or in total state-owned. And when you're doing business with the Chinese Communist Party. And there are many companies that do not want to be in that position.
We only have a few minutes left, and I'd like to bring the conversation back home if we can for the last question or so. Christina asks, we talked a little bit earlier, Senator, about technology, and you mentioned AI. And Christina asks, given the emphasis on AI, what kinds of protections do you envision that need to be embraced to protect Americans' privacy? And this can be related to the Huawei question as well.
Yes, and Christina, we had a hearing in Commerce this morning on the issue of privacy. We had the Federal Trade Commission commissioners in, and one of the topics that we covered was the issue of privacy. The way I frame this is to say, who owns the virtual you? You in your presence online, being the virtual you. And as Americans conduct more of their work life, their transactional life, their children's educational life, they want to be able to protect that privacy. One of the things we discussed this morning, and it's something I have worked on for, actually, I've had this legislation for 8 years, the Browser Act, which would establish a federal privacy standard. And this is important for individuals, for their privacy. The EU moved forward with the GDPR. We have not put a federal standard down. One of the issues also when it comes to privacy is data flows, cross-continent data flows, and the business that is transacted from companies here and in other countries, and being able to have those privacy safeguards in place. Now, actually, I think our friends in the EU and the UK, and I have visited with their parliaments and their legislators, they anticipated we would be the first to move forward with a federal preemptive privacy standard. We have not done that, and I do think you will see us do that maybe even this fall. And you're spot on when you talk about it in relation to AI. And as companies begin to use artificial intelligence as a form of being more efficient and effective in their operations, then it is important for individuals to be able to have the ability to wall off their data and the utilizations of that data. So my hope is that, yes, when we come back in September, you will see us move forward with something that would be a federal privacy standard that would protect individuals.
Well, we still have a lot of questions. I wish we could do more. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I think we've really covered a great deal from foreign policy to domestic policy, tech policy, and the like. Again, for those of you who haven't, I urge you to read Senator Blackburn's white paper on China. It is available at blackburn.senate.gov, and it's really excellent and comprehensive and meshes with many of the other pieces that are coming out of Congress. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Senator Blackburn, I want to thank you for your time, for joining us. Great conversation. Before I let you all go, however, I want to mention that our next Capitol Conversations will be August 12th at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, with Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland and Research Fellow Lan Hee Chen of the Hoover Institution. They will be discussing federalism and COVID-19. You can learn more about this series at hoover.org/Capitol Conversations. Again, Senator Blackburn, thank you, and thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you'll join in next time.